John here with Ripewave Audio, back again with the flagship AV receivers that premium audio company puts out under the brands of Integra, Pioneer, and Onkyo. These are namely the Integra DRX-8.4, which sells for about $3,300, the Pioneer Elite VSX-LX805, which is just under $3,000, and the Onkyo TX-RZ50 that sells for $2,800. And in this video, we are going to start configuring these with the Dirac Live that comes standard with this, using their mobile app as the first pass on running Dirac with these. And this continues our series that we did. And we had our first video where we compared these against not only each other, but the tier below them from Pioneer, Onkyo, and Integra, as well as competing products from Denon, Yamaha, and Sony, which most closely resembles the channel count and price point that these models have to offer. At this point, we're going to get into the setup of these, not only compare the setup screens for each of these models where you go through each function, point out how they're different from one another. They're mostly the same. There's a few differences. And we'll even point out how these differ from the tier below, namely the Onkyo TX-RZ50, which I had direct experience with. Now, of course, Pioneer and Integra also have a tier below, but I don't have that close-up view, so I can definitely do it with the RZ50. So let's get into this. Now, you'll also see on my bench a couple of other products. Actually, we have 6 AV receivers or processors in our theater right now. I said 5 in the last video, I counted wrong. But of course, we always have the RMC1 from Emotiva, the Cinema 50 from Marantz, but I still have on the bench here the Sony STR-AZ7000ES, another flagship from a competitor of theirs, and we can do a sound comparison as we do this series while this one is still here. So that's a great opportunity, as well as the other 2 models. But let's get into the setup. So when you first power these on, it's ready to go with an initial setup wizard. And this is exactly how we proceeded with these units. And you can see I've always got on the screen here, you're going to see the largest view being Integra, the Integra being the most expensive. I made an assumption that it would mostly be a superset, but there are some exceptions to that where Pioneer comes in with some unique menu pages, but we'll point those out as we go along. But largely, these are copies on the UI for each of these 3 brands, with some subtle differences, like the Pioneer always has like a picture of their receiver in the background or something a little more glossy than the other 2. And Onkyo tends to mimic Integra more often as far as the cosmetics, that blue line highlighting what you're going to be clicking on next, versus Pioneer, which is a white gradient highlight behind things. So just some subtle differences there. You can follow along. Even the text is pretty much the same. And when you first bring this up, it's thanking you for choosing the product. So let's get on with the show. On this screen, it says prepare and connect everything, as they say in the initial setup guides that came in your box. Here they are, one from Pioneer, one from Integra, and one from Onkyo. And these pretty much all say the same thing. I opened them up and compared them, and they do walk you through a step-by-step here. The problem I see with these, and I've had the same problem with the TX-RZ50 from Onkyo, it really just walks you through a 7.1 setup and not a 7.1.4, which is the maximum configuration. And I find that a little odd that they didn't just say, here's what would you do with the maximum configuration. And if you have less speakers, just connect up less. But anyhow, here we are. You just kind of look at those quickly, and you do your wiring and you set them aside, and we can always make some adjustments as we go. Next, it will tell you that there's going to be 4 steps to go through here. There's going to be a speaker setup, followed by a multi-zone sound check. I find the name a little confusing, multi-zone. When I was doing the Onkyo video with the TX-RZ50, I was thinking zone 2 and zone 3 in another room. But really what they're getting at is all the speakers in the zone. So I think it's a mislabeled there. And then there's an ARC setup, which you can bypass, and then Dirac Live through a mobile app. So we're ready to go. We say yes. Speaker setup, and it will talk you through your speakers. Now, it defaults to a 7.1.4 channel configuration, which is exactly what we have in here with both subwoofers configured, and I have 2 subwoofers, and these are all multi-sub units. But you can have less speakers than a 7.1.4, and starting with 2.1. And as you grow your system, or some people are content at a certain level, you can add more and change your configuration as you go. But you can add a center channel, make it 3.1, bring in some rears for 4.1, and so forth. We've got all the ear level types of layouts up to 7.1. And then it goes to a 2.1.2 configuration where you have 2 in the ceiling and 2 in the front with your subwoofer. And then, of course, you have the 3.1.2 with a center channel and 4.1.2, 5.1.2, 6.1.2, 7.1.2. And then you bring in a second row of heights, 4.1.4, 5.1.4, 6.1.4, 7.1.4. And that's your maximum configuration. So you are limited to just 2 rows. You can't do 3 rows of heights, as we've seen in other products like the Sony flagship that's sitting here, or front wides. Again, the Sony supports front wides on that product, but it also has a couple more channels of processing. So the next thing that we're going to look at is the subwoofers. And I will call out here that the RZ50 is only a single subwoofer output, and it doesn't give you these options in the setup menu. But all these are 2 subwoofers independently controllable. A couple of models actually have 4 outputs on the back, 2 pairs, and each pair is wired in parallel with each other, but you do have 2 discrete outputs. So the Pioneer is going to give you that, and the Integra is going to give you that, but the Onkyo is only 2 outputs, but those outputs on the RZ70 are discrete. But otherwise, these look the same as far as the setup, whether it has 4 subwoofer outputs or 2 on the back of it, the configuration is the same because internally they're treated the same. So you can do a variety of from no to subwoofer 1 to both of them, and we're going to normally leave them at both of them, but I wanted to show you it has this other options. If you had the Pioneer or the Integra model, you have this option of passive subwoofer. What's a passive subwoofer? A passive subwoofer is one that doesn't have a built-in amplifier, and you need to get the amplifier from somewhere else. Now, if you're using an external amp, I think you could just use the subwoofer pre-outs and not worry about this passive subwoofer. But if you want to use one of the amplifiers in either the Pioneer or the Integra model for powering a subwoofer, you can. So you can have 1 or 2 channels of a passive subwoofer, or a mix with an active and a passive, and you have those configuration options. But you do not have this option with the Onkyo. So going back to our 2 active subwoofer configuration going out the pre-out with no passive, and what we have in our room, we'll now look at the heights, and it starts at top front. Now, one odd part about this is when I select the other options, if I go now to top middle, notice that it automatically changes height to speaker to rear high from where it was before, which was top rear. I just find that kind of an odd UI change there. I just think it's something that they should clean up in their coding. Why change the height 2 configuration if you're fiddling with height 1? And it does it with each of these brands regardless. So there's a consistency there. So you can have a top middle, you can have a Dolby speaker in the front, you can have front height speakers, and now we're back to top front is which we have. Ours are mounted in the ceiling. So we go to height 2. Here's where it switched it to rear height, and it's not what we had. It started with what we had. So we need to cycle through this. So we go rear high, Dolby speakers on the surround sides, or Dolby speakers on the back speakers, or the top rear is what we have. So now we move on. The zone speaker, now this is turned off by default, and we can turn on zone 2, or we could bring in a zone 3. But we will note on the Onkyo, in order to bring in 2 and 3 for zones, you got to back down to a 5.1.2 channel configuration, which I find odd because the Pioneer and the Integra let you do zone 2 and zone 3 with the 7.1.4 speaker configuration. So this is a quirk, and obviously something you can't work around with the current firmware. I don't know why they've done this. But if you're planning to do both zone 2 and 3 and wanted to use some of the internal amplifiers, you are capped at a 5.1.2 channel, even if you're using external amplifiers. So that's interesting. So we're just going to set that to no because we're not using zone speakers in our setup. Zone 2 pre-out could either be zone 2 or zone B. That doesn't really matter to us. Again, we're not using zones. We'll just leave it zone 2. Now you do have the option to buy amp. Now this is going to be turned off, but if you back your speaker configuration down to, let's say, a 5.1.4, you're able to use those channels you're giving up for your theater system layout and allowing you to do a front speaker with buy amp. If you're willing to back down to a 7.1 configuration, so no height channels at all, you can also add bi-amping to your center channel. So both your front and center, your 3 in the front, being bi-amped, but you have to drop down to a 7.1. And then you have a choice of speaker impedance. And we covered this when we did the TX-RZ50 videos. And this is something that's recommended to leave at 6 ohms, even if you have 4 ohm speakers. And it is going to put some restrictions on these units. If you set it to 4 ohm, it's going to cap more things. And I think they do this for some regulation reasons, but it will work perfectly fine at 6 ohms and above setting, even if you have 4 ohm speakers. So generally speaking, unless you're worried about overheating, leave it at the 6 ohm setting versus moving it to 4 if you have low impedance speakers. We now come to an option which is only available on the Pioneer, and this is a crossover setting, and by default it's set to common. You can also toggle this to individual. Now what I've learned later on, you can go and change this later on, and part of why this is different than the Integra and Onkyo has this clips mode, which is setting for you the crossovers based off of certain models of clip speakers if you have them. We'll come back to this a little later. Just make a mental note that Pioneer allows you to set it here, although it didn't really have to be because you can go and change that later on, and we'll talk about it a little bit later as we walk through this. It's giving you a summary of everything that you selected so far, or most everything you selected so far. And if this looks good to you, we can hit next. And it does look good. I can see that Pioneer's got a nice speaker image on their menu page where they don't have it on the other two, but it's otherwise the same summary. Now it's saying that it's going to check the speaker connections. And I think this is a very good step, an important step. You're going to be listening and making sure that all the speakers are wired to the right terminals, whether you're using the amplifiers built into the receiver or you're using pre-outs and an external amplifier. You want to test this. Now, one I often mix up is my front and rear subwoofers, and I like to put the front one on subwoofer 1 and the rear one on subwoofer 2. and I get those crossed, I've got to label my cables a little better, and then I will know. It walks you through this, and it does a pink noise on each of these channels, and you can step through all these that you've configured, and these are the same speakers, provided that you've configured them the same for each of these models. So those are all good, and if you're hearing the test tone going out the right speaker, then you're good here, and you can say next on this, or you can go back to the speaker setup. At this point, it's asking you to do ARC setup. Now, we don't use ARC for a couple of reasons. When you use ARC, I understand that ARC or eARC can be good for those who are giving a priority for their video. If you want your ultra high definition Blu-ray player or your streaming device to go directly to your TV so that there's nothing in the middle that could degrade the signal, you could send it to your TV first, and then the TV can send you the audio to the AV receiver. And it works, but what you give up on is on-screen display. If you're using ARC or eARC, you will not have an on-screen display, and I like that, although I could see in some cases it being distracting if you want to make some changes and you have an audience in your theater. So it's a matter of preference. I had trouble getting ARC to work this time. I know I got it working with the TX-RZ50 when we had this 6 months ago, but some reason I can't get it going, and I'm sure it's some simple thing I've missed, but I'm not terribly worried about when I actually ran this and said, yes, I got this error. I said, eventually, I tried it a few times, and then different cables, different settings, moving things to direct connects. But regardless, I went and bypassed that, and I went on with the room EQ. And I said, yes, I want to do this. Now, here's another place where I'll call out a difference with the Pioneer. On the initial setup for room EQ, Integra and Onkyo are just saying yes or no later. Pioneer not only says that, but it's giving you a choice of Dirac Live or full auto MCACC, their own proprietary room calibration. Now, I don't know how different that is from AccuEQ, which Integra and Onkyo use. I suspect they're the same, but we'll find out. We're going to run through those at a later date or do it later. So regardless, let's say we're going to move forward with Dirac. And when you get to this page here, then they're saying similar things, but this is where Integra and Onkyo say, no, switch over to AccuEQ, and then Pioneer's just saying, no, I'm just going to exit entirely. Nevertheless, we're going through with starting Dirac. It's the first choice here. Now, for Dirac to work, we need a network setup because it forces you to use a mobile app on your phone, and without the network setup, you're getting nowhere. We do the network setup, and we're going to accept the privacy statements. And ultimately, then it's going to ask you about Chromecast. Well, I don't know why it's asking us here. We don't need Chromecast to do the Dirac, so I just said no, and I don't use Chromecast. And then you have a choice of wired or wireless networks. Now, I've tried it both ways, and they work for all three of these, and they work the same way. If I put an Ethernet cable on this, the wired works and sets up pretty quickly. We say yes, or we hit wireless. I can go through and have it scan for networks. It will display the networks. I've kind of obfuscated the networks that are here. But ultimately, there's this, let's call it home network, that they all had in common, and that's what we connected them all to. And we put in the password, and the password gets entered. You can push the memory button, and of course the memory button is labeled different on the Pioneer than the Onkyo. That one's called plus fave or memory, but the functions are the same. and the location is the same on the remote, just labeled differently. So I put the password in, and it will do a connecting and ultimately give you information of success if everything went well. And this is whether you're doing it wired or wirelessly, it presents these status information. Here is where I took a break. I didn't want to get in and do a calibration without running the latest firmware on each of these. And I thought there was a high chance that these things got shipped to me, not with the latest firmware. So I stopped the whole process. I hit exit here. At which point we got into the menu pages for these three receivers. Now, Integra and Onkyo go right into a 7 or 8 choice menu option, versus Pioneer gives you this more appliance-like looking graphical choice of 3 main things. Are we going to do a system setup? Are we using the calibration, the MCACC Pro software, or are we doing network connections? So for the Pioneer, I want to go into system setup. And then for the Integra and for the Onkyo, I want to go into miscellaneous. And then from miscellaneous, go into firmware update. And it will show here the update notice is enabled by default. When I took this screen capture, for some reason, I must have toggled it to disabled, or that's the way it was on the early rev of the firmware. But I've since cleared memory and everything. It always seems to come back to enabled. But the version here, although these are different brands, what they shipped with was this R100, all bunch of zeros, 0031 rev, despite being different brands and different models. So I said, okay, I'm going to do an update, and I'm going to do this over the network, not using a USB. Now, if we somehow couldn't connect to the network or the internet through these devices, we could bring it to a USB drive, plug it into it, and we can update the units that way. But I did it through the network. And when you do this, it says you could take up to 30 minutes. It didn't take 30 minutes for us, but it did take a while because it has to download and install. And when it was done, it displayed the new rev. So this, instead of R100, this is R108-0202-1110-0131. Again, it's the same for each product. So these are getting lockstep new firmware with a new version, I think about the same time. And I think the last one that came out was in September, and that's the one that added in Oral 3D support. A lot of you were glad to see them add that, and it came at no additional charge. So since we've interrupted the process in which we were doing the install wizard, we can get back to it. So if you go into miscellaneous again, item 4 is initial setup. And then by hitting initial setup, it then says, okay, we need to plug in the microphone, this little hockey puck thing, that it seems to be the same microphone that's come with all of these. It comes in with an 1/8-inch phono jack, this little thing with screw terminals on the bottom that can plug into a tripod, and it's ready to go. So once you plug this in, it recognizes that signal. It automatically switches to this next screen. It says, follow the app. What app? It's an app on a mobile phone or a tablet. I think they have it for both Android and iOS. At this point, you're switching to the mobile device that's on your phone. Each brand has their own app. So Integra is called Integra Control Pro. Pioneer is called the Pioneer Remote App. And Onkyo calls it the Onkyo Controller. If you look at the screenshots here, they're the exact same app, just reskinned for different brands. Each of them have their own icon, and you can see that on the upper right here of my screenshot. and you launch the respective app to get into the model you're seeking. Now, you're only going to bring up Onkyo products with the Onkyo app and so forth. So there's no way to use one app for two different brands here. So you have to have all three apps if you have all three brands, as we do. It walks you through the terms of service and the privacy statements and its data usage if you want to allow them to collect data. We usually deny those. And it says the UI has been renewed, and we go into device management. And when you do, you get to select the unit here. So each of these is divided up into three different selections. So the Integra DRX-8.4, you see it as main, zone 2, and zone 3. It can treat all of those separately. On each of these, we connected to the main, selected those, and said done. And this is what we're going to control with the app on this is the main. And at this point, we want to do the Dirac live process. It could take up to 20 minutes. It could take less. It could take more. We'll talk about that in a bit here. It's confirming your speaker configuration. Yes, I have 7 channels. I have 2 subwoofers. I have a top front and a top rear height speaker. So this all looks good. And I hit yes. And here they're asking if you want to use Dirac Live bass control. Now, Dirac Live comes at no additional charge with these units, but Dirac Live bass control is a fee. That's $350 for single sub or $500 for multi-sub. Now, we're not sure we're going to keep any of these long term, so I'm not paying for the license right now. So we're just going to continue without Dirac Live bass control. With the mobile app, and this is a deviation. If you're familiar with Dirac Live, you may be familiar with using it on a laptop with the Dirac Live app installed. And when you run it from there, you start off with a 9-channel use. Well, here they also give you a 3-point, but they don't give you anything beyond 9-point that you see in the full application that runs on a laptop. So I find that interesting. And I went through this before with the Onkyo TX-RZ50. I wasn't happy the way the mobile app works and some of the limitations that you have with it. Yes, it's very convenient, but sometimes it's not so convenient if you can't fully visualize what you're trying to do. I understand what they're trying to do with the mobile app. They're trying to make the cost of entry to do Dirac Live cheaper than anything else out there. Not only do you don't have to buy an extra license as you do with Denon Marantz, nor do you have to buy a laptop or a microphone, which you often have to do with other brands. Now, like my Emotiva, they did give the microphone and all the accessory boxes to make it work, but they didn't give you a laptop. So I happen to have a laptop. So if you have a laptop, go ahead, put the Dirac Live. It can be a MacBook or it can be a PC, and it will install. They're trying to make the cost of entry Dirac Live cheaper than anybody else, and they've succeeded. In doing so, this mobile app takes away things. It takes away some of the multi-points beyond 9 points for measurement. It takes away a lot of the visualization that you can do, and it takes away a few other things, which we'll get into as we go through this. So let's move forward. We're going to use the 3-point here because I know I'm just going to throw this away and come back later with the PC version. This is for demonstration purposes only to let you know how the mobile app works. It's going to do an auto level calibration. And when this runs, this auto live calibration, this is something I find lacking with the mobile app. Unlike the PC version, I really have a trouble of knowing. I feel like I've lost control. Well, it has this auto calibration. I do find myself still going back in and trying to tweak everything. And I just don't feel like I have the same level of control as I have in the full computer version. I like being able to measure the noise floor and trying to do 20 dBs higher than the noise floor for each one of these speakers. This tries to do it for you. I had a problem. When I was originally using this particular microphone, it was working, but it seemed like all the subwoofer values were quite low, and I had to bump them up almost 12 dBs. Then it got to a point, because I had to run this over and over again to test different things out. I couldn't get it to calibrate with this microphone. And I thought it was something I had wired, but then the test tones were working. And what it turned out, I said, well, I got two other microphones just like this sitting over there, one for each of these receivers. I'm going to just plug in a different microphone, because if something went wrong with a microphone, this could be the problem. Sure enough, when I plugged in another microphone, a brand new one, it worked better. It was at the levels, and I could finally complete the calibration. This uses very thin wires on it, and I'm not sure if like a wire came loose or something with the microphone itself. It was doing all the speakers but the subwoofer as well. It seemed to have lost the ability to do the low frequencies, and I was turning those subwoofers all the way up to maximum, and it still wasn't measuring in range. There was something wrong with the microphone. When I plugged in the good microphone, it was way off the scale. So I had to dial them back to where I normally have them, at a halfway position, 20 clicks in on these rhythmic subs, and it was perfect. A little bit of tweaking, and we got it right, and we could finally get through it. So with that said, once you have your levels adjusted, and provided your microphone that you have is good, and you have to use the Onkyo or the Integra or the Pioneer provided microphone when you're using the mobile app version. And once all that is done, you can go and do your measurements, whether that was a 3-position or 9-position measurement. It will go and do this, and it will test each speaker out and walk you through each of those positions. Now, that microphone is all at the same constant height, about ear level, for all of either the 9 or the 3 measurement positions. Once all of them were done, it does its calculation and ultimately transfers them to the receiver. All that data is stored in the receiver. One thing that we learned, and this was even back in the RZ50 testing, is it writes to all 3 slots. Now, there's a reason for that, but it also means that if you're using the other calibration methods that these support, it will always overwrite all 3 slots available. So you can't have one that's running the MC-ACC or the AccuEQ on one slot and Dirac in another slot. It's just not going to happen. It's one or the other. You can't simultaneously run both and compare. That's something I can do with the Cinema 50, is compare Dirac Live against Odyssey. With that all installed, we do have another option. Your screen for your Integra, your Pioneer, your Onkyo is going to say, thank you for purchasing. You can always go back to the initial setup, but essentially you're finished, and you can hit enter and it will take you to normal runtime. So you can always go back and rerun this. But the Dirac Live configuration through the mobile app is only available, at least the way I can tell, is through the initial setup process, which I find odd. Why couldn't you just go right to Dirac Live and do it that way? But you got to run through the initial setup process again. Now, one thing I noticed and couldn't really stand is this mobile app version of Dirac Live will time out pretty quickly. I didn't time it, but it seems to be something short, like 60 seconds. And if you leave the room and you hit, calibrate the room, and I left the room and I said, I'll come back, and when it's finished, I'll go to the next thing. Well, it'll run through all the speakers, and after 60 seconds, time out, and I got to restart the process. Now, you have an option of restarting with the same data, but it's just annoying. It just keeps automatically disconnecting my session, and I got to restart it. I don't like that. Don't time out on me. Just keep it in the calibration mode. When I'm in the PC version, it doesn't do that. If you've loaded this in through the mobile app and you come back to the mobile app, and this time it's not running in Dirac mode. So if it connects to your receiver and it knows it's got a calibration going on, it can only do calibration related things with Dirac Live. If you don't have it going on, it goes to its normal playback type mode where you can change the volume and all that. But part of this, at the bottom part of the screen, there's an icon there for, it looks like an EQ. And if you hit that, you have the normal treble and bass and all that, and listening modes. But you have a Dirac Live section in here. And those are provided that your session downloaded to your receiver in a good way. Now, if it didn't finish, it might say go back to the calibration, and then it gives you a chance to finish, and then ultimately come to this screen where you can select which Dirac slot you're going to use. Now, by default, when you first do your measurements, all three slots are got the same flat profile, and it's really tuning it to flat. Or you can turn it off. But you can hit Edit Filter Curves. And when you do, it will show you the three slots. And notice they all have the same time stamp here. And when you go in, let's take the first one here. It's showing you here. Now, when it made it flat, it was doing it for about 63 hertz on the low end. And I can't remember on the high end, but it's over closer to 20,000 hertz on the high end. And it's set this to flat. But you can go in and put as many points on this chart and fiddle around on the target profile that you want it to hit versus just flat. And this gives a little more character. You could boost the bass or cut out some part where your crossover on your speaker is not handling well. And it does this in pairs, so we can look at front, center, surround, and all that. And the left and the right, or one and the two, are linked together unless you break the link, and now we can do a different curve for left versus right, or subwoofer 1 and subwoofer 2. So there's some flexibility there on how you do your profiles, which is nice on this. You can also copy from other slots. Copy from slot 2, slot 3. You can reset your editing, or you can just simply end it if you like where it goes. And you can send something to the receiver once you have it the way you want it. And this is where slots 1 through 3 become meaningful if you're using the mobile app. Now, there's another way of doing this. So obviously it has its proprietary, whether that's AccuEQ or MCACC, depending on whether it's Pioneer or Onkyo Integra. There's an undocumented feature, which is you can hook this up to a laptop running Dirac Live application using any microphone of your choosing. And this is the only time it lets you use something other than this cheap microphone, is when you use the PC app for Dirac Live, and it will work. And I did that with the RZ50. I'm going to run it again for these units, prove out that really works. And that's undocumented. I haven't found anywhere in their literature says you can run that app. But I would recommend doing it that way. One thing that I've come accustomed to looking for now is, do they have a web page to get to some of the same stuff? Well, all these do have a web page, and I put the IP address in, and I was disappointed to see that this is pretty basic information. So there's really two pages once you go into the IP address. And you first log in with admin, but it makes you change the password on first logon. Change it to whatever you want it. Once you're in, you can give it a friendly name. You can give an AirPlay name, put an AirPlay password, a login password, update the firmware, do some Control-4 stuff, or you can hit the network page and do some of your network settings, and that's it. I really think this is for a custom integrator to come in, connect to your network remotely, and make some of these changes, but they're not doing any configuration stuff through this, so I don't think that gets them that far. Just maybe get some connections there. So the web page isn't gonna buy you anything. I did want to see how it's setting things like the crossover. So I went to the speaker setup menu. Now with Pioneer, you do have these unique menus. When you hit the menu button on your remotes, it's even labeled differently on the Pioneer. So this is the Pioneer. It looks like a home button. And the Onkyo and the Integra have a gear looking like thing, but they're in the same position on the remote. We will go into the speaker setup and we'll go into crossovers, and we can see Integra and Onkyo default to crossover type normal. And by default, they're all set to 70. I could set this to clips mode. If you set it to clips mode for the crossover, then you have to leave this menu page. I don't know why, but you have to leave it to something called speaker combo in section 210 on both of these products. Now, on Pioneer, you don't have the clips mode. It does not support clips mode. Instead, this is where you have the individual versus common, which we saw in the setup. And essentially what happens, if it's set to common, you essentially have for each speaker pair, large or small. If you set it to individual, you can set it to full band or any of the other crossover frequencies. And what we found was, as you cycle through this, regardless of the brand, they start at 40 hertz. If you go to 80 hertz on Integra and Onkyo, it puts the THX next to 80 hertz. It doesn't do that for Pioneer, which is not THX certified. And they go up to 200 hertz, and you can do that range, 40 to 200 hertz, on any of the speaker types. There is a feature called double bass. If you happen to take your front speakers and set them to large or set them to full range, you can turn this on. I think it defaults to on for Integra and Onkyo, but for some reason it defaults to off on the Pioneer. If you see something different, but that's my experience. Even though it's a large speaker, it will still send low frequency information to your subwoofers. So if you really want good, strong bass, you can send it for both your front towers and your subwoofer, even though they're rated large. Speaker combo mode. So we don't show anything for Pioneer because they don't support this. Only Integra and Onkyo have speaker combo. So we get this under option 10 under speaker. So this is 2.10. By default, the brand is other. Now you could have all clip speakers, or you could have a mix. A lot of us build up our systems over a long time. You have a mix of brands, but we can go set this to clips, and your front speakers could be other, and your center speaker could be clips. They give you the flexibility of setting which speakers are clips. So if I go into the front speakers and I change it to one of the options, there's only certain models that allow me to set front speakers. It could be a Clips Reference Premier 5000F. It could be a Reference R41M or R40M, or it could be the Clips Custom Installed CS16C. This is for the front speaker. For the center speaker, it's specific Clips models again, the RP404C, the R34C or 30C, or the custom installed CS16C. What I find odd about this, why don't they just give me the full list? What if I had an acoustically transparent screen with 3 RP5000Fs up in front? I couldn't select that for the center. I have to use these specific center channel models. On the heights, a very similar thing. It has to be the reference Premiere RP500SA or the reference R41M or 40M or the CS16C. On the surround channels, it's the same options as the front as well as the surround back. Those three, all the same options. The subwoofer has to be the RP1000SW on the reference Premiere or the R100SW under reference. On custom install, it's the Pro 1000SW. I just put some options here just to see how this comes out. So let's go back to the crossovers and see what happens when we do this. What we find out is it's gone and set all these. The front became 50 hertz. So did the surround and surround backs, which I set all to the same speaker type. The center speaker became 120 hertz and the heights became 180 hertz. I have no option to change these, nor can I scroll down to see the subwoofer. It's not visible to me. Even though there's a down arrow, I can't see it. So I'm stuck. I can't see what the crossover they're setting to the subwoofer. But this is how it works today. I was also curious how it was managing distances with the auto calibration. What I did find is, and this is typical of a Dirac Live, instead of displaying it in feet or meters, it displays it in time, which is really what these systems are doing, is putting a time delay on things so they all arrive at your ear at the same time. It really doesn't care about the distance. So these were relatively close for each of the speaker types, regardless if it was Integra Pioneer Onkyo. So their algorithm seems to be working the same way. There's a margin of error, so it'd be a little difference. The other thing I looked at is level calibration. Again, they're trying to get the volume, if given the same signal output, all equal. And this is how they had to adjust for my speakers, my amplifiers, and my room acoustics. So it appears at where I'm sitting at the main listening position to be about the same volume. And again, these were very close, so I'm not going to worry about these. And that takes us through our first round of calibration with Dirac Live on the mobile app on these 3 units. Very similar experience as I had on the Onkyo TX-RZ50. What are your thoughts? Would you want to use the mobile app, or are you curious now about either their proprietary or a full-blown Dirac Live on the PC or Mac application? That feedback would be useful. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you want to take your involvement in this community to the next level, consider our Patreon channel at www.patreon.com/Ripewave, or you can always give us a one-time donation. And that's been really helpful, and it's allowed us to have a triple viewing here. I mean, I put a lot of money on my own money out front, over $9,000 to make this happen on my own money until I return him. As always, you can hit that bell notification so you're notified when the next video is posted. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.